In chapter 12, Jesus had been teaching in the temple, and the chapter ended with him sitting down opposite the treasury in the temple and commenting on the poor widow who put in her 2 mites. Now, chapter 13, he leaves the temple and gives his disciples what's known as the Olivet Discourse. It's Jesus' longest, most important, and detailed discussion of eschatology. And it's called the Olivet Discourse because Matthew 24, verse 3, says that Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives when he gave it. In it, he deals with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in AD 70. He discusses his second coming, and he exhorts his followers, in light of these eschatological events, to remain faithful. And he concludes by discussing how final judgment will occur when he returns. So let's go through that, and the Olivet Discourse takes up all of chapter 13. Verses 1 through 4. And as he came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Well, most agree that the Olivet Discourse relates to Israel's rejection of Jesus, of Christ's rejection of Israel, and the disciples' questions concerning when these things are going to be. When is the temple going to be destroyed? Also, Matthew adds in Matthew 24, verse 3, that the disciples had an additional question, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The Olivet Discourse is Jesus' answer to these questions. Now, in verses 5 through 13, he gives signs of the time that will occur between his first coming and before he comes again. Those verses say this: "And Jesus began to say to them, 'See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and they will lead many astray. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. These are but the beginning of the birth pains. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils. You will be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. And when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, do not be anxious beforehand what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." Now, I should point out, before briefly talking about this section, that the Olivet Discourse is analyzed and discussed in detail in our Ecclesia book on biblical eschatology, chapter 8. So I would suggest for a much more detailed discussion and analysis of the Olivet Discourse, you take a look at that. But in this part of his discourse, verses 5 through 13, Jesus is dealing with certain outstanding features in the inter-Advent period. In other words, the time between his first coming and his second coming. And verse 7 reminds us that all of these things, wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, persecution, all of these things, famines, these do not signal the end. The activity of deceivers, people coming in his name, all of these things are not to be regarded as signs that Jesus is coming right around the corner. We don't know when he comes, as he will say later on. he says specifically that these are the beginning of sorrows. Now, Christ's statement in verse 13 that you will be hated by all, and the preaching of the gospel to all nations in verse 10 are reminders that there is an extended period of time between his two comings for these things to be fulfilled. But verses 10 and 13 clearly bring us to the end when it says, first, the gospel must be proclaimed to all the nations, and the one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, there are people who say, well, we know that he's right around the corner because they look at the newspaper or TV and they see wars in all kinds of places, all of these things. And they'll say, oh, there's more earthquakes now. These things have always followed a pattern. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. What Jesus is saying is, these things are going to characterize the entire time before I come again. Don't be surprised. You cannot predict by counting the number of earthquakes or the number of wars or anything else as to when I am coming. You have no clue. It's going to be a complete surprise when he comes again, as he will explicitly say later on. Now, verses 5 through 13 are sort of giving an overview. The whole time between his first coming and his second coming is going to be characterized by all of these events. And we can't look at any of them as saying he's coming right around the corner. He may come this year. He may not come for 1,000 years or 10,000 years. And none of the things that we see happening in the world give us any clue. That's what he's saying. Because all of these things have always taken place. They're very unspecific. But in verses 14 through 23, he talks about a specific event, the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. He's answering the question about these beautiful buildings, and then he gives a recapitulation. So 14 through 23. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then, if anyone says to you, look, here is Christ, or there he is, look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. Now, this section begins with the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, which occurred in AD 70. And then it recapitulates the entire time between Christ's first coming and his second coming. This cannot be a continuation of what he had just said, because verses 10 about the gospel being preached to all the nations, and verse 13, those who endure to the end will be saved. Those brought us to the end. And so what he's now doing is he is beginning in verse 14 by talking about the events surrounding the destruction of the temple. Now, the abomination of desolation, which is referred to in verse 14, was also talked about in Daniel 8, Daniel 9, Daniel 11, and Daniel 12. In 167 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid king who was ruling over Israel, had sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple and made the practice of Judaism illegal. Now that prompted the Maccabean revolt, which lasted from 167 to 164. Now, in the apocryphal book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 54, the abomination of desolation was applied to the desecration of the altar by Antiochus Epiphanes. Nevertheless, in the first century, many in Israel believed that Antiochus had not completely fulfilled Daniel's visions of the abomination of desolation, because Daniel had promised the advent of the kingdom of God after the sanctuary had been profaned, but the kingdom had not come when the sanctuary was rededicated. And therefore, the people reasoned that the woes suffered under Antiochus must prefigure further woes to come. And that's the same way Jesus is taking the abomination of desolation. He views the times of Antiochus as prefigurative of what lay ahead. And he uses the same kind of language that Daniel used to apply to the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem by the Romans, which happened in AD 70. And as a matter of fact, that is exactly how first century Jewish historian Josephus took it. He said in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews, "And indeed it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and that he wrote many years before they came to pass. In the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them." And that's the same way that Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, early church historian Eusebius also took Daniel's vision. Now, the specific identification of the abomination of desolation is unclear, but it is clearly related to the events of the Jewish war by the Romans in AD 66 to AD 70, because the parallel passage in Luke 21, which is also the Olivet Discourse, says, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near." Now, the surrounding armies are probably not the abomination of desolation themselves, but they signal that the desolation is near. That suggests that the desolation is the destruction of the temple and the city. And so a number of things have been proposed as to what the abomination of desolation is. Some say it is General Titus, who stood in the temple. Some say it's the Roman standards that the Romans worshipped, which were brought into the temple area. Some say it's the Roman army surrounding Jerusalem. One writer says it's probably the attempt to be overly precise in identifying the abomination of desolation is probably misguided, although it is indicating something that was going on in the period leading up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Now, some people, of course, as you may know, take the abomination of desolation to refer to some end-time Antichrist figure. That clearly is not the case. Christ admonishes his disciples, when you see this, when you see the abomination of desolation, or as he said in Luke, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that indicates the events of AD 70, because he's talking to his disciples. The you is in the second person plural, and the events that took place in AD 70 were in the lifetime of the disciples. And so, as one writer points out, surely Jesus does not denounce the first century temple in which he's standing by declaring it desolate, by prophesying its total destruction, and then by answering the question, when shall these things be? And by warning about the temple's abomination of desolation, only to speak about the destruction of a totally different temple some 2,000 or more years later. Furthermore, the references in Daniel 9 and Daniel 11 to the abomination of desolation suggest a human person, and that's the Maccabean and Antiochus Epiphanes background. Daniel is not suggesting some supra-historical end-time Antichrist figure. And think about this. Jesus, as he makes clear, He is the true temple. He prophesied the destruction of the temple. Now, the people who think the temple is going to be rebuilt and then an end-time Antichrist is going to come and he's the abomination, they do not understand biblical theology, because the temple was simply a type or a shadow pointing to Jesus. The temple sacrifices have been superseded by the sacrifice Jesus made. Therefore, even if a temple building is rebuilt in Jerusalem, it would not be a holy temple. It would be an idol, IDOL, temple, with no more theological significance than the Dome of the Rock mosque that is the Islamic mosque that's there now. So nothing that might occur in a future rebuilt temple, if there is one, and that's very debatable, could possibly be the abomination of desolation. Now, we know in verses 14 through 18, Jesus says, when you see these things, then flee into Judea. That therefore cannot possibly refer to some end-time event just before Jesus comes again. Because as one person said, if it refers to the end of the world, what difference does it make whether the end comes in winter or in the summer? And the things described in the Olivet Discourse parallel. I mean, they're talking about a siege when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, says Luke, and that's exactly what happened. And so, if the events that he's talking about here do not relate to the destruction of Jerusalem, then Jesus never answered the disciples' main question: when is the temple going to be destroyed? So the fact is that this is referring to the events leading up to the destruction of the temple. Now, verse 19 says, there will be tribulation such as not taken place from the beginning of creation until now and never will be. Now, it is true, of course, that the Nazis in World War II killed 6 million Jews. Stalin killed 20 million of his own people. So there have been bigger wars with more people killed. But actually, Jesus is correct. In the context of the Olivet Discourse, the Great Tribulation, which he's referring to, is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and not some end-time event. And we know that from the wording here, because Jesus' reference to the Great Tribulation and Mark 13:19, the reference to the Great Tribulation, begins with the word for. In other words, he says, you are to flee when you see this happening, for or because there will be great tribulation. And so Luke says the same thing. So the very fact that the Great Tribulation that Jesus is referring to here is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, not a worldwide event, that's what enabled Jesus' followers to flee, as they did, the early Christians did. Furthermore, Jesus' statement is actually correct. In the context of there's been no city. Josephus reports 1.1 million of the city's inhabitants were killed, and then 97,000 more taken off into slavery. Never has any other city suffered to that degree, despite all the wars that have taken place. Furthermore, this had to be the Great Tribulation for Israel because their temple was destroyed. And as a result, they no longer have the temple, and they can no longer practice Judaism biblically. And so, furthermore, the events in verse 19, it requires a lengthy period of time following these events. It says, in those days, there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of creation until now and never will be. That requires that there be a lengthy period of time after that great tribulation, because if it's talking about the end times, it would be inane to say there will be no tribulation like this and it never will be if he's talking about something happening just before the end of the world. You see, it requires the and never will be requires a lengthy period of time, and the Lord can't be talking about his second advent or events just before he comes again, because then Why should his disciples pray about fleeing from Judea? What good would running to the hills be if Jesus is coming again? And again, what difference does it make whether it's summer or winter? It doesn't make any difference. So the context and the wording are indicating he's, with respect to the abomination of desolation and the Great Tribulation, in context here, he's talking about the events of AD 70. And Jesus' language, I should also point out, is very typical prophetic language in that many great disasters in the Bible are talked about as being the greatest thing that has ever happened. For example, in Ezekiel 7, it talks about the Babylonians who took Jerusalem in 586, as he says that is a unique disaster, the end has come. That if it's unique, that means it couldn't happen again. Well, it did happen again. So Jesus is using typical prophetic language. Now, what he's talking about may foreshadow events that take place before he comes again, but it will not be the exact same thing. It's the kind of language that, yes, wars and rumors of wars will continue, and we can't tell when he's going to come again. So verses 20 through 23, then, where he talked about the cutting short of the days, and the false Christs would arise and false prophets, be on your guard. Again, those are things, false Christs and false prophets, that will characterize the time from his first coming until his second coming. But there's a distinction. Remember, with respect to the events of AD 70, when the temple in Jerusalem were destroyed, he said, when you see the abomination of desolation, probably related to the Roman armies, then flee from Judea. But verse 20, he talks about the Lord cutting short the days. That indicates the time of his second coming, because how the elect were saved in AD 70 was that they fled, as Jesus said. But how the elect are saved and not entirely wiped out when Christ comes again is God cuts short the days, Jesus comes again to save his elect. So cutting short the days was not required and did not happen in AD 70. It will happen when he comes again. And so then verses 24 through 27 describe the second coming of Christ. It says, but in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory, and then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the four ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. Now, this is describing in, it may be literal, it may be figurative language, but the cosmic events involving the sun, moon, and stars and the powers of heaven are probably meant to be taken literally, because this is the climactic nature of the Son of Man's final disclosure. His reference to the Son of Man coming in the clouds echoes Old Testament language in which clouds often symbolize the presence and glory of God. His reference to sending the angels and gathering the elect reflects what he said, particularly in the parable of the wheat and the tares in Matthew 13, where, and it also reflects the language of Revelation 14, where he talks about sitting on a cloud, sending the angels to harvest. So this is language that Jesus has used before and will appear again, and it's clearly talking about the second coming of Christ. Now, verses 28 through 31, Jesus gives the parable of the fig tree. And he says this, from the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now, the parable of the fig tree is related to the signs which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and it has nothing to do with the founding of modern Israel in 1948, as some people allege. In the language he used, and again, we talk about this in detail in our book on biblical eschatology, Jesus contrasted the things that you see, the things that are near, the things that will happen in this generation, with the things that are far away. And in fact, in Luke, we know that the fig tree here was not referring specifically to the founding of modern Israel, because in Luke 21, verse 29, Jesus says, "Behold the fig tree and all the trees." The fig tree is simply a metaphor or an easily understandable object lesson that Jesus was pointing out what was soon going to take place. And again, this generation is talking about the generation of people who were living in the first century along with Jesus. In fact, as N.T. Wright points out, as a prophet, Jesus staked his reputation on his prediction of the temple's fall within a generation. And if and when it fell, he would thereby be vindicated. And that is exactly what happened. Now, the Olivet Discourse here ends in verses 32 through 37, which says, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Be on your guard, keep awake, for you don't know when the time will come. It's like a man going on a journey, when he leaves home and puts his servants in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to you, I say to all, stay awake." Now, so again, he was contrasting this generation, what you will see, with, but concerning that day or that hour. So look at the language he uses. He's contrasting the things that are near, that would take place in that generation, namely the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, with now, beginning in verse 32, concerning that day or that hour. Now he's talking about the second coming of Christ, when he comes again. And now, notice, he says, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father, when he comes again. So he's, how much clearer could he get? There's a lot of people who try to predict, but if Jesus didn't know, if the angels don't know, how does anybody today think he's going to know? That it's impossible and unbiblical. Jesus makes it crystal clear. Now, some people say that, well, we might not know the day or the hour, but we might know the week or the month or the year or the decade or the century or the generation. No. The phrases, that day and that hour, are what's known as terms of art. That day and that hour stand for the second coming of Christ itself. They're not used in distinction to the week, the month, the year, the century, or the decade. No, that day and that hour is referring to the second coming of Christ. And so it's a well-defined, the day and the hour are well-defined eschatological terms referring to the second coming of Christ. And in fact, one writer points out that every occurrence of the hour or that hour in Revelation refers to the second coming of Christ. And that's exactly the way Jesus is using those terms here. He's using them in a technical way to refer to his second coming. And so his disciples would see the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but they will not be able to tell because no one knows when Christ comes again. So let me conclude this lecture by saying this. Many people throughout history have tried to calculate when Christ is going to return based on events happening in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world. All such attempts are incredibly wrong-headed and are always wrong. Prophetic signs are not designed to enable us to calculate when Christ comes again. Jesus said, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, not even the Son. I mean, how much clearer could he get? Earthquakes, famines, false messiahs, false prophets, these things are not the kind of events that will pinpoint the moment in history when the Son of Man will come back, but they're the things that characterize the entire period before his coming. And as I said, the day and the hour are not contrasted with the week, month, year, decade, or century, but are technical terms signifying the second coming itself. And finally, look at how Jesus ends this. He ends this by saying, stay awake, remain faithful. In Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse, he ends with 3 parables, the whole point being, because you don't know when I'm coming again, that's the very reason why you need to remain faithful, because I could come at any time. So don't be asleep. Stay awake. Be watchful. And so the Olivet Discourse has an important moral purpose. It is not there for us to predict when he's coming, but it is there to tell us in general what's going to happen throughout history, and that his coming will come as a complete surprise to everybody. Therefore, stay awake. The premium on discipleship that he is stressing is not predicting the future, but on faithfulness in the present, especially in trials, adversity, and suffering, which is why he said those things, trial, adversity, and suffering, will be directed against the church until he comes again. He knows he's in charge, so remain faithful.